Haley Cooster was 19 years old, snow-caked boots, and a 3-inch chain already riding in the loader bucket, when she crossed the snow line on State Road 60 toward 3 grown men who had run out of ideas about what to do with a Peterbilt 389 buried to its rear axles in the ditch of Nobles County, Minnesota. The supervisor from the recovery company, a man from Cincinnati who had never set foot on a farm in his life, looked at her and said something. You're going to want to know exactly what he said. But that answer only makes sense once you understand what was inside that red tractor, and what that girl had already been proving before she ever left the farm. If this story already has you, hit the like button right now. You have no idea how much that helps this channel grow. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button, because every single week there's a new story you won't find anywhere else. Now tell me something. What's the hardest situation you've ever been in? On a job, on a road, in a field, where everybody doubted you, and you proved them wrong anyway? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. It was February of 2023, and the storm that dropped on Nobles County that week was not the kind you drive through on stubbornness. It was the kind Minnesota produces when it wants to remind everyone who's in charge. 25 inches of snow in 34 hours, northwest wind at 37 miles per hour, stacking cordons of 6 feet along the county road shoulders, temperature of -18 Fahrenheit, with a wind chill of -42. The sky had gone white sometime around 4 in the afternoon on Monday, and hadn't come back gray since. It was the kind of day you close the office window, look outside, and feel grateful you don't have anywhere to be. 3 things happened at the same time on that Tuesday morning that put everybody on the same stretch of road. The first was that a dump truck driver for Riordan Excavating, a 26-year-old named Derek, tried to navigate Nobles County Road 10 with 62,000 pounds of wet sand in the box, at the worst hour of a still active storm, because the dispatcher back in Worthington had read the map wrong and assumed the road was clear. It wasn't. There was a sign, but the sign was buried under 5 feet of wind-drifted snow. Derek saw the curve too late, hit the brakes. The left rear tandem axle broke loose on a patch of black ice that was under the snow that was under more snow, and the Peterbilt went sideways with the full authority of something that weighs 79,000 pounds gross, because that's exactly what it weighed. The truck pivoted, left the pavement, and sank the right rear axle into the ditch shoulder at a 40-degree tilt. It hadn't rolled, but it was buried deep enough that when Derek opened the door and looked down, the right rear tire had vanished completely into the snow. All that showed was the hubcap. Derek sat in the cab for a full minute before he opened the door. Not from panic, from calculation. He was 26 years old, but he had grown up watching his father drive, and his father had taught him the one rule that matters most when something goes wrong on a job. Stop, breathe, think before you move anything, because the wrong move on a stuck truck can go from bad to worse in about 4 seconds. He had seen a truck roll on his father's watch once, back in 2011, a gravel hauler outside of Jackson, Minnesota, that a driver tried to rock free by backing hard. The rocking worked 3 times, and then the 4th time it didn't, and the truck went over on its side and took $11,000 of road surface with it. Derek remembered the sound. He didn't want to make that sound. So he sat. He checked that the trailer brakes were locked. He confirmed the load hadn't shifted. The sand was wet and dense enough that it hadn't moved, which was the one piece of luck in the whole situation. Then he opened the door and looked down at where his tire should have been. The second thing was that Riordan called Summit Recovery Solutions out of Des Moines, Iowa, because Summit had a reputation and a clean website and a heavy recovery rig that had cost $380,000 and that the company owner photographed at every trade show he attended. Summit sent 2 men, the rig, and a supervisor named Craig, who had 21 years in the industry, and who was described on the company website as a specialist in heavy vehicle recovery under adverse conditions. The third thing was that Summit, arriving on County Road 10 with the heavy wrecker, tried to position for a winch pull and dropped its own rear axle into a drainage ditch hidden under the drifted snow. The $380,000 rig from Summit Recovery Solutions was stuck 40 yards from the Peterbilt it had been called to rescue. Craig stood in the snow with the wind hitting his jacket, looking at 2 tilted trucks at the same time, phone in his hand, not sure who to call next. Somebody called the QUADTRAC farm. Here's where the story turns, and it turns because of something so small you'd miss it if I didn't point it out. The phone number Craig received was for the farm. He expected to reach Bill QUADTRAC, 58 years old, who had been working that land since 1991 and who most people in Nobles County knew at least by sight. Bill QUADTRAC was the kind of farmer you respect without having to ask why. Calluses you can see from across a room, eyes that have counted too many winters, a way of talking that cuts straight to the point and stops there. But Bill wasn't home. Bill had driven to Worthington before dawn for an equipment financing meeting and had been stuck in town since 10 that morning because State Road 60 had been closed by the county sheriff. The person who picked up was Haley. Craig explained the situation. Haley listened. Then there was a pause of maybe 3 seconds. "You have chain?" she said. Craig said he did. Haley told him she'd be there in 10 minutes. Craig didn't ask her age, didn't ask what she'd be bringing. He probably pictured a 150-horsepower utility tractor, the kind every Midwest farmer keeps around for pushing snow and moving hay. The kind you call when you need a fence post pulled or a stuck ATV dragged out. Not exactly what Haley had in mind. Now, I need to stop here and tell you what was sitting in the QUADTRAC farmyard, because without this, the rest of the story doesn't make sense. In October of 2019, Bill QUADTRAC signed papers on a Case IH Steiger QUADTRAC 715. It wasn't an easy decision. It's not the kind of equipment you buy after thinking it over for a week. The QUADTRAC 715 rolled off the assembly line in Fargo, North Dakota, with an FPT Cursor 16 engine, 16 liters of displacement, 6 cylinders inline, turbocharged with aftercooling, 715 horsepower at peak power, and a peak torque rating the manufacturer lists at 1,724 foot-pounds. That's not a number you read and immediately understand. That's a number you understand when you watch what it moves. But the number that actually matters in this story isn't horsepower, isn't torque. It's a number most people have never heard, and it is the precise reason why a 19-year-old girl was the only person in Nobles County capable of solving that problem. The number is 4.8 psi, pounds per square inch. You need to understand what that pressure means. Think about how a loaded semi-truck tire works. A loaded Peterbilt applies its entire weight across the contact patch of each tire against the ground. Each rear drive tire has a ground contact area of roughly 35 square inches under normal conditions, depending on inflation and load. 79,000 pounds divided across 6 rear tires produces a ground pressure somewhere between 110 and 125 psi per tire. 125 pounds per square inch. That's why heavy trucks sink in soft ground. That's why Derek's axle disappeared into the snow. Each tire was concentrating enough force to compress the ice layer beneath the snow, lose flotation, and keep sinking. The QUADTRAC 715 weighs approximately 34,800 pounds, heavier than an empty Peterbilt, and yet it floats on terrain where the truck sinks. Why? Because its weight is distributed across 4 independent rubber tracks, each one 36 inches wide. The total ground contact area of all 4 tracks under operating conditions is approximately 38 square feet. Do the math, and you arrive at exactly that number: 4.8 psi. The same pressure a full-grown adult human applies to the floor just standing still. Less than a large dog. The QUADTRAC walks on top of snow. Not through it. Not into it. On top of it. The tracks spread the weight of 17 tons of iron and steel across a contact area so large that the ground beneath barely registers the load. When you understand that, the entire story reframes itself. It wasn't about raw power. It wasn't about horsepower. It was about physics. The Summit wrecker was stuck because it had the exact same problem as the Peterbilt, amplified, more weight, less contact area. No wheeled truck was going to pull that Peterbilt out of that ditch. You could bring a second wrecker, then a third. They'd all sink. The only piece of equipment that could solve that problem was a machine that didn't need the snow to support its own weight. And in all of Nobles County, in February of 2023, during the worst storm of the winter, there was exactly one machine that fit that description within a reasonable operating radius. It was sitting in the Coester farmyard with crusts of dark October topsoil still packed into the track links. The machine had covered more ground than most people in Nobles County would drive in a year. In its first full season, the fall of 2019, the QUADTRAC had planted just over 8,000 acres. Soybeans on the south fields, corn on the north rotation, winter wheat on the 240 acres Bill had been running in a 3-year cover crop cycle. That first season was also the one where Bill realized he had bought something that operated by a different set of rules than every tractor that had preceded it on Custer land. In a wet October, when the neighboring farms were grounded for 2 weeks waiting for the fields to firm up enough to carry equipment without compaction damage, the QUADTRAC was still running. The tracks spread the load so evenly across the soil surface that the compaction depth was measured in millimeters, where other machines left ruts measured in inches. Bill stood at the field edge one morning and watched the QUADTRAC cross a section that had standing water at the low corner. Watched it go through without leaving a mark deeper than a boot print, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he went inside and made coffee. And by the time Haley came down for breakfast, he had already run the numbers on what 2 more weeks of planting window was worth in yield certainty. He didn't tell Haley what he was thinking. He never did. But she noticed he stopped complaining about the payment. Haley Coester grew up inside that farm. Not the poetic version where a child runs through wheat fields learning the values of the land from a wise grandfather. The real version, which means waking at 5:30 to feed cattle before school, which means missing volleyball championship games because equipment broke during harvest, which means learning to operate a tractor before learning to drive a car, because on a farm you need the tractor before the DMV gives you a license. Her mother had left when Haley was 11, without leaving more than a note and a Sioux Falls address that never led anywhere. Her father was Bill Coester, who talked little, worked constantly, and expressed affection in ways that take years to recognize as such, like putting his daughter behind the controls of the most expensive machine on the property before any seasonal hire had a chance to touch it. Haley had been in the cab of the QUADTRAC 715 since the day it arrived from the dealership in October of 2019. She was 15. Bill put her in the seat, walked her through the dash in 20 minutes, not because he expected her to understand everything in 20 minutes, but because he trusted she'd figure out the rest, and went back to the office. In 3 weeks, Haley was operating the QUADTRAC alone. In 2 months, she knew what the engine sounded like when the coolant temperature was running a degree too warm. In 2 years, she could tell the difference between the tractor responding normally and the tractor responding slightly below itself. and she had already caught a water pump problem that would have cost $11,000 in dealer service if it had been missed another 100 hours. There was one thing nobody knew about the Coaster QUADTRAC 715 except Bill and Haley. In September of 2022, during harvest, the QUADTRAC had pulled a deep tillage combination implement that had packed into wet clay soil at the bottom of one of the lower fields. The implement weighed 46,000 pounds. The QUADTRAC pulled in first reduction, all 4 tracks biting into the mud, and freed the implement without the engine approaching its limit. Haley was in the cab. She felt the resistance, felt the tracks searching for traction, felt the moment the implement broke loose, and didn't say anything to anyone about it, because to her it was the normal work of a normal day. There was a specific evening she thought about sometimes, not the harvest incident, not the tillage pull. An earlier one, from January of 2021, when a blizzard had come through fast enough that Bill hadn't been able to move the round bale feeder to the east lot before the drifts cut off the access lane. The cattle needed feeding. The lane had 4 feet of wind-packed snow across it, and the wheel loader wouldn't make it without getting bogged in the softer drift at the midpoint. Haley took the QUADTRAC out at 7 in the evening with the temperature at -11 and the headlights cutting yellow into the blowing snow, and she just drove down the lane. No drama. The tracks compressed the snow, and the tractor went through the drift the way a hand goes through smoke. Not fighting it, not slow, just continuous. She fed the cattle, came back, parked the QUADTRAC, and went inside. Bill was sitting at the kitchen table with the radio on. He looked up when she came in, and she said the cattle were fed, and he nodded and went back to what he was doing. That was the moment she understood that the machine wasn't about horsepower or impressive specifications. It was about being able to do the thing that needed doing when the conditions said it couldn't be done. She knew, better than anyone in Nobles County, what that tractor could do. When she came across State Road 60 with the QUADTRAC, the 2 Summit employees who were outside, Marcus, early 30s, and Pete, mid-40s, turned and watched her approach without saying anything for a moment. Not because they were impressed, because they hadn't expected it. What crossed the snow line was a 5-meter-tall red tractor on rubber tracks, making a low, heavy, rhythmic sound on the packed snow, and the person in the cab was wearing a work jacket that was a size too large and cowboy boots that were clean from the knee up and snow-packed from the knee down. She had a hat on. She had tattoos that showed at the wrist when she opened the cab door to get down. Craig came toward her with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who is about to explain something obvious to someone who doesn't fully grasp the situation. "Look," he said, and Haley looked. "I appreciate you coming out here. I really do. But what we've got here is a traction problem. That tractor's not going to get enough grip on this ice to go anywhere, let alone pull that Peterbilt." Haley looked at the Peterbilt, looked at the Summit wrecker stuck 40 yards back, then looked at Craig. "You have the chain?" she said. Craig stood there for 2 seconds, then said yes, they had chain. It was on the wrecker. Haley asked him to get it. Craig went to get it, still wearing the expression of a man who is about to waste time on something that won't work. "Now I need to slow this down, because this moment deserves to go slow." Have you ever held on to something that everybody told you to throw away? Marcus and Pete pulled chain from the wrecker's storage bin. It was 3-inch grade 70 transport chain, heavy, the kind Summit used on heavy recovery jobs. Haley looked at the links, estimated the length, then walked to the Peterbilt to assess the anchor point. The Peterbilt had a recovery hook on the rear frame rail, below the dump body. It was buried under snow, but accessible. She went down on one knee in the snow and reached in with her hand to feel the hook, checking whether it was intact, checking the angle the chain would need to run. Craig watched. He crossed his arms. "Do you know how much that truck weighs?" he said. Haley stood up, knocked the snow off her work pants, and said, 79,000 gross, maybe 75 with the load shifted. Craig opened his mouth and closed it again. Nothing Craig said after that point was significant enough to repeat here. He kept talking. Haley kept working. Marcus and Pete, who were employees and not the boss, figured out much faster than Craig what was happening and began helping anchor the chain to the Peterbilt's rear frame with the seriousness the situation required. The chain was secured to the Peterbilt's recovery hook. The other end was anchored to the QUADTRAC's hitch point, a reinforced receiver welded directly into the tractor's frame, rated for exactly this class of load. Haley checked each link, checked the angle. She thought through the pull direction without saying it out loud. Not straight back, because the Peterbilt was sitting at 40 degrees, and a straight pull would dig the axle deeper rather than lift it. Slightly lateral, combined with a progressive upward force to compensate for the tilt. She climbed back up into the cab, closed the door. The sound of the wind dropped. Inside the cab of the QUADTRAC 715, the world has a particular quality that isn't silence, but is containment. The FPT engine idles at a base register you feel more in your chest than hear with your ears. The dash is wide, with diagnostic screens in color that read temperature, oil pressure, RPM, and individual traction load. Haley didn't need to look at the screens to know what the engine was doing. She knew this tractor the way someone who has spent 4 years in a cab, 4 hours a day, learns to know a machine. Not through numbers, but through personality. She selected first reduction, not first range. First reduction is the heavy work gear, the one that converts torque into slow, relentless pull. The kind of force that doesn't move fast, but doesn't stop for anything. The QUADTRAC's transmission is automatic power shift, no clutch pedal, gear selection managed electronically by engine load. But in first reduction, you don't shift, you just pull. Craig was outside. He had uncrossed his arms, not because he'd changed his mind, because the situation had arrived at the point where there was nothing left to say, and it was time to wait and see. Marcus was standing near the Peterbilt, at a safe distance, watching the chain. Pete had backed up further. Haley applied pressure to the throttle with care, letting the engine find the load before asking for more. This matters. You don't lunge at 79,000 pounds of stuck truck. You introduce force gradually. Let the chain come tight. Feel the moment when the entire system goes taut. And only then do you ask for more. The chain came tight. Slowly. The sound of it changed. Went from loose and metallic to a sustained low note of steel under tension. Then it went quiet, stretched, vibrating slightly the way a cable vibrates when it's carrying more than it was built to carry comfortably, but less than it will break at. The QUADTRAC began to pull. All 4 36-inch tracks began to turn. In snow, the sound of rubber tracks is different from dirt. More muffled, more absorbed, a continuous compression that doesn't have the chatter of uneven ground. The tracks didn't sink. At 4.8 psi of ground pressure on the packed snow of State Road 60, the QUADTRAC sat on the surface like the snow was asphalt. The rear tracks, where the greatest torquey load was applied, left compression marks 5 inches deep. The Peterbilt's tires had sunk nearly 28 inches. Physics was being demonstrated in real time. The FPT engine climbed in power. Not dramatically. In first reduction, the horsepower is concentrated in torque, not speed. The sound changed from steady bass to something fuller. A rumble that carried effort without distress, the way a large animal carries a weight that would be impossible for anything else but is simply a load for it. Haley felt the resistance through the seat and the controls. Not violent, but constant. A pushback she recognized. Nothing moved for 11 seconds. 11 seconds is a long time when you're standing in the snow, watching a chain stretched between a tractor and a buried truck, and seeing no movement. Pete, who had worked for Summit for 9 years and had seen hundreds of recoveries, told someone later that he had never watched a pull like that one. Not because of the machine, he'd seen bigger. Because of the way the operator managed the load. Most drivers, he said, in his experience, when they hit 11 seconds of no movement, they either back off or they throttle up hard. The back off breaks the tension and you have to start over. The throttle up risks shock loading the anchor point, which on a buried truck frame can mean the hook rips free and sends chain backward at a speed that takes doors off vehicles. Haley did neither. She held the pressure exactly where it was. Not more, not less, as if she could feel through the cab floor and the tracks and the chain and 40 yards of taut steel exactly what the situation needed. And the answer was patience. Pete said he didn't know her name at that point. He thought she was a kid. He stood in the snow watching the chain and thought, whoever taught that person to operate equipment knew something that most people don't get taught. Craig stood through 11 seconds with the same expression. On the 12th second, the Peterbilt's right rear axle moved. 1 inch, 2. The chain shuddered. The QUADTRAC's engine climbed half a note in the rumble. The rear tracks compressed a little deeper into the packed snow. Haley didn't increase the throttle. She held the pressure constant, letting the engine work within the range where torque was maximum, not asking for more than the system could deliver progressively. The rear axle moved more. The Peterbilt rotated slowly, the way a large ship turns in a narrow harbor, the 40-degree tilt decreasing to 35, to 25, to 15. Marcus took 3 steps back without thinking about it. The Peterbilt came up out of the ditch. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It came up with the slowness of something very heavy being moved by the right force applied the right way, inch by inch, until there was enough momentum for the axle to find the pavement edge and climb. When the right rear tire touched the asphalt, it made a low, dense sound, the kind of sound something that weighs many tons makes when it returns to where it belongs. The Peterbilt was on the road. Haley brought the throttle back down. The QUADTRAC's engine returned to idle, low, steady, unhurried. She climbed down from the cab, walked to the chain, and began releasing it from the Peterbilt's hook. Marcus came to help without being asked. They worked in silence for a couple of minutes. Then Marcus said, "Thank you." "No problem," Haley said. Craig had stayed about 30 feet away through all of it. When the chain was freed and Haley was walking back toward the QUADTRAC, he crossed to her. His expression had changed. It wasn't exactly respect. It was the kind of quiet that fills the space where certainty used to be. "What do I owe you?" he said. Haley looked at him. "Call my dad," she said. "He handles that." She climbed back into the cab, closed the door. The QUADTRAC turned slowly on the snow-covered road and began moving back in the direction of the farm, tracks compressing the snow in the heavy, even rhythm Haley had known since she was 15 years old. "There's something I haven't told you yet." When Bill Cooster came back from Worthington that afternoon, after State Road 60 was reopened, Haley was in the kitchen making coffee. Bill noticed the snow pattern on the QUADTRAC's tracks was different from what had been there that morning. Different compression, different direction. He asked what had happened. Haley told him in maybe 4 sentences. Bill listened. Then he went to the freezer, took out 2 steaks he'd been saving for the weekend, and made dinner. That was all he said about it. That Haley had done the right thing, delivered in the only language he had. 3 weeks later, Craig sent an email to the Coester Farm contact number. It wasn't addressed to Bill. It was for the young woman who had operated the QUADTRAC. He asked whether she would be willing to discuss technical consulting for soft ground recovery situations, specifically for cases where conventional wheeled recovery equipment lost traction. He'd been thinking about what he saw that day and had concluded that Summit Recovery needed to understand its own equipment's limitations better before accepting contracts in deep snow conditions. Haley wrote back and said she could talk, that her dad would probably need to be on the call too, and that she preferred Tuesday afternoons. The consulting arrangement with Summit ended up being 3 calls over 6 weeks. On the first call, Haley explained the ground pressure math in about 8 minutes, drawing on the back of a seed catalog at the kitchen table, while Bill sat across from her drinking coffee and not saying anything. Craig listened from Des Moines. At one point he interrupted and said he wanted to run the numbers with his equipment supplier, and Haley said that was fine. And then she gave him the exact contact patch calculation for the Summit Wrecker's rear axle configuration from memory, because she had looked it up the night before. There was a silence on Craig's end of the line. Then he said, "Where did you go to school for this?" Haley said she was in the middle of an online agronomy program out of South Dakota State. Craig said, "I meant before that." She told him she hadn't gone anywhere before that. She'd learned it here. Craig didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, let's keep going." They spent another 40 minutes on weight distribution and track versus tire traction in saturated soil, and by the end of it, Craig had 2 pages of notes. That conversation happened. Summit Recovery Solutions changed its winter protocol for snow recovery operations in Iowa and Minnesota after that. They began coordinating with local farmers running tracked equipment before accepting contracts during active winter storms. Haley didn't get famous from it. No headline. She went back to work on the farm, kept running the QUADTRAC, started studying agronomy by correspondence in the winter evenings because the nearest university was too far for a farm schedule. Bill bought a second QUADTRAC in 2024. He let Haley spec the configuration. The Peterbilt 389 from Reardon Excavating went back to work the following day, after the storm cleared. Derek, the driver, did something nobody asked him to do. He stopped at the Coester farm 3 days later to say thank you in person. Haley was out in the field with the tractor when he arrived. Bill received him on the porch, said it was nothing, offered coffee. Derek said he had never seen anything like it. Bill drank his coffee, looked out across the field where the QUADTRAC was moving against the horizon, and said, "She knows what she's doing." There was nothing else to say. The Coester QUADTRAC 715 completed its 3rd planting season under Haley's operation in the spring of 2023. The 4 36-inch tracks still carry, pressed into the rubber, traces of dark soil from County Road 10's shoulder, mixed with clay from the lower field, which is the heaviest ground on the property. Nobody cleaned it off, not out of carelessness. Because on a farm, what the equipment carries in its tracks is part of the record of where it's been. Now, before you go, I have to send some personal shout-outs, because I know exactly who's watching this. To everybody in Texas, Dallas, Houston, Lubbock, Amarillo, San Antonio, all of you. The winter is different down there, but the working hard culture is exactly the same. Big love to Texas, to the folks in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas. You watched this story, and you felt that February cold from the inside. You know exactly what that snow looks like. Thank you for being here. To my people in Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, and Oklahoma, the backbone of American agriculture. The stories that matter most come from your part of the world. To everyone in Georgia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Alabama, The South has its own working culture, and I see you every single week in the comments. To California, Oregon, Washington, the West Coast farm crowd is real, and I'm glad you're here. To Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, the Great Lakes and Rust Belt crew, every week, steady. Appreciate all of you. And to every other state I didn't call by name, I know you're there. I see the comments. Now here's what I want you to do. Drop in the comments the name of your city and your state. Be specific, city, state, and if you want to, what you do for work. Because in the next few videos, I want to send personalized shoutouts to specific cities, not just states. The more of you put your location down there, the more places I can name by name. This channel exists because of real people in real places, and I want to know exactly where you are. The QUADTRAC is in the field. The road is quiet again, and Haley Kuster has 19 years old and more operating hours on that machine than any recovery supervisor from Des Moines is going to accumulate in his entire career.